Hello, YouTube. Team Mosin, happy to be coming to you again today from the bunker. Today's a day I've been looking forward to for quite a while since we started the Team Mosin channel, and that would be to simply introduce you and discuss with you the namesake for the channel, the Russian Mosin Nagant rifle. Just to kind of hit the high points very quickly for you. Most of you would recognize this, the name of the rifle, and on sight as the Russian battle rifle from primarily World War I and World War II. That's how those of us in America know of it and think of it best. But it was actually invented in 1891, and it was originally called the three-line rifle, Model 1891. Something along those lines. Three-line being a unit of measure in Russia at that time. A line actually being a unit of measure, which was roughly a third of an inch, which would correspond to this being 30 caliber rifle. Specifically, though, in Europe, the nomenclature there is 7x62 by 54R. In Europe, anything that's a 30 calibers is designated a 7.62 the millimeters for the measurement there. So in any event, in Russia at the time it was invented, they weren't even doing metric. They were doing whatever line. So Russian three-line rifle model of 1891 was what it was originally called. In America, we know it as the Mosin Nagant rifle from those times. Or just plain old Mosin. We America, we call it, we do what we want. We call it what we want. So we call this the Mosin. But it's actually Mosin Nagant, namesake of the two gentlemen whose contributions to the rifle in terms of design were utilized. There was actually a contest from the Russian Army at that time. They were looking for a new rifle for the Russian Army, and the primary competitors were Mr. Mosin with his model and Mr. Nagant with his model. Mr. Mosin was Russian. Mr. Nagant was Belgian. Some people would maybe suggest that Mr. Nagant's rifle was actually superior to the Mosin in some ways, but nationalism won out, as you would expect it to, or at least would not be surprised that it did in Russia. And so the Russian model, the Russian design, was chosen as the new rifle for the Russian Army. However, there were some things, as I said, pertaining to the Nagant rifle that was submitted that were favorable compared to some things for the Mosin rifle design. And so the rifle became known as the Mosin Nagant because Mr. Nagant, some of his design features were incorporated, particularly the round feeding system and the box magazines, apparently, were of his design, and along with this feeding system in here for the magazine and the cartridge pickup and ejection as far as the magazine would go. So those features of the rifle were utilized from Mr. Nagant. Mr. Mosin apparently had the rest of it. And so the Mosin Nagant rifle, model 1891, or primarily the ones we see here in America are simply model 9130s. What that means is it's the long version. It's the regular version that was given to the infantry. It's the version that you see primarily in movies such as Enemy at the Gates. That's this rifle. Anyway, some of the reasons that the rifle appeals to me, and one of the reasons I've really come to love it since acquiring this particular model, this particular example, I should say, of the rifle, is that it is 30 caliber. It is a substantial rifle round for that time and even for today. Again, the designation 7.62 by 54R, meaning that the case itself is 54 millimeters long. You take our current 308, which is 7.62 by 51 is the military designation from NATO for our 308 cartridge. So you can see that the Mosin Nagant actually has 3 inches in cartridge length on case length, actually on our 308. And so with today's modern powder, you actually have a little bit of an advantage. In some ways, you can actually get a little more powder into a Mosin Nagant case, so much so that some people have referred to this as the poor man's 30-06. We'll show you in a moment. I'll show you some cartridge comparisons, but it is by no means a poor man's 30-06. It's really not even close. But in any event, as I said, millions of these were produced in Russia. What's really cool about these is most of them were produced in 3 plants in Russia. The Tula plant, which many of us are familiar with. They still make ammunition stuff. Also, the plant was the Ivhesk factory. It's where this one was made, which were a large number of them that you can get your hands on. And in America these days were made from the Ivhesk factory. And the other one was the Sestroyek factory. Probably butchering that name, but that's about as close as I can come to. It's one of those Russian names. It begins with an S. Begins with an S and ends with a TSK, and there's about 5 syllables and very few vowels in between. So near as I can come to it is Sestroyetsk factory, which is apparently near St. Petersburg. Also produced quite a few of these rifles. What's cool about Mosins in one aspect is when you do get your hands on one, regardless if it is one of the 9130s, which are kind of the B-flat bottom of your shoe type version of this rifle that's everywhere in America, you find that it's either that model, or perhaps you do find some of the carbine models, different carbine models that were out there. There was a couple of different versions of that. There was a carbine called the Cossack version, or Cossack carbine. There was another one that was a Dragoon carbine, and there may have been some other ones out there. Those were primarily versions of this rifle that were used and developed by other countries, such as Hungary and Poland, maybe Romania. And they were used in Russia too, issued to cavalry units and whatever. Again, being a carbine version, they were a little bit shorter. The standard 9130, the barrel on that is somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, of at least, it's 25 inches at least in barrel length. And so the whole rifle is quite long, which is quite common. The Mauser was the same way. Those original Mauser rifles, very long barrels on those, maybe as long as, 28 inches, maybe even on some of those Mausers. But the Mausers, in comparison to the Mosins, which all are pretty much of the same caliber, in fact, almost universally the same caliber, of 7.62 by 54R, using the same cartridge and bullet, no matter what Mosin you get your hands on, that's the bullet that it takes. Mausers, as you may know, depending on when and where they were made, and they were made everywhere. They were made, of course, they started in Germany, but there were, Mausers that were developed and built under contract from Paul Mauser and his company, many countries in Europe, the Italians had Mausers, the Turks had Mausers, the Chinese had Mausers, and a lot of times when you get into those Mausers from those other countries, especially when you get into the ones that were in South America and that region of the world, here in our hemisphere, they were in all kinds of different calibers. The original Mauser from Germany being 8mm, 8x57. When you get to the other countries and later years, when that rifle was being produced for the armies of different countries around the world, largely in those countries, was where they were being manufactured at times. They could be anything from 6.5mm clear to 7.5mm. Some of them were still made at 8mm. And with the Mausers, you do have different action and receiver types and sizes, and then of course you have all the bolt face variations to accommodate those various calibers that the Mauser showed up in over the years around the world. Whereas with the Mosins, not so much, man. What you see is what you get. It's always 7.62 by 54R. It's not a very sophisticated bolt action. It lacks the fine engineering and finish and balance, even if you would say of a Mauser. It doesn't have all the fancy locking lugs front and rear that the Mauser has. It does have lugs. It's got a couple at the front there, and it does have a nice lockup at the rear. But it's a rifle that was made very much with having kind of a wartime emergency production. Not very fancy. You might even say crude. But that's kind of what attracts me to this rifle. This rifle was not designed and produced necessarily with a professional army in mind. This was a rifle that they could hand to anybody, and as Russia, as Russia needed to over the years in any of the various wars that they fought, they had professional armies, of course, but many times they were also using, kind of a citizen force, and especially in the Second World War, their army was largely recruits that were very young, 17, 18-year-olds, maybe even younger. Hardly what you could, hardly what you could really consider a professional army, in the sense that, they didn't receive a lot of training. They weren't well supplied. They were basically, taken as recruits and shoved right up to the front line. And they were handed this, if they were even handed a rifle. A lot of times they weren't handed a rifle. They were just handed a couple clips of ammunition, told go, pick up a rifle off the ground when you get there, if you can find one. And so, that's the idea behind this. Is attractive to me. It's very utilitarian. It's tough. You can't break it. It's easy to take apart for the most part. And it's, it only goes back together about one way. And, that kind of simplifies things. You don't have, a real complicated, set of, pins and screws and stuff that you've got to worry about, as with many, the Mausers were the same way. They were made to be easily taken apart and clean. And of course, the Springfield 30-06 that the United States had was almost a direct ripoff of the Mausers, to the point that the Mauser company actually sued Springfield back in the early part of the 1900s and won for copyright or patent infringement or whatever it was in those days. Yeah, but they were all kind of made to be, taken down and cleaned and maintained very easily. The Mosin, very much so. There are not very many parts to a Mosin. There certainly aren't very many delicate or, parts that can be lost or damaged as you take it apart, for the necessary field cleaning. And, it's just a great little rifle that, a lot of these now are getting on to 80. This one was manufactured in 1942, getting on, to 80 years plus, and they're still just as tough and functional, and they shoot pretty much the way they did the day they come out of the factory, with a few exceptions. This particular rifle, before I go any further, everybody's probably looking at it going, what the heck is that? This is actually a 9130 Mosin Nagant, made in the Ivhest factory in 1942. It's Type 3, for those of you that care. It's a Type 3 receiver, I believe, which was one of the later versions of the receiver. It's obviously a round receiver, which they went from the hex receiver to the round receiver during wartime as they got up, I think, starting in about 1936. And they did that simply. Round receivers are easier to produce than hex. A lot less machining, a lot less to worry about, just making a round receiver, and as opposed to having to get that hex receiver right every time. And so, it's a testament to those great designers, it's a testament to those great factories, and it's a testament to all those people who, built these rifles and re-arsenaled them over the years. Most of them were rifles, as the wars went on, after the First World War, particularly, they all came back, and wherever they, whoever happened to have them, at the end of that war, they were rebarreled, new stocks, and, they were packed away for the next time. Well, the next time came around, World War II, and, they unpacked them and used them again. And those rifles through that war were, depending on who captured them or who ended up with them, whether it was, the Germans or the Finns or, whoever ended up with them, they also simply, had armies of people working in factories to, rebarrel them and, re-arsenal them, clean them up, fix them up as much as possible, slap a new stock on them, and put them into storage again for the next time. And that's how they all came to America, beginning, especially in the 90s. There were just warehouses full of these in Russia. And, you know, they'd been packed away since after the Second World War. They were packed in cosmoline. This one had a lot of cosmoline. I also did refinish the stock. You can tell it doesn't have that red purple color to it. I actually spent quite a few hours with a lot of brake cleaner and a heat gun, sweating cosmoline out of the wood stock and cleaning it up and refinishing it. Obviously, this one has also had I use a scope on this rifle. Actually, the Mosin Nagant lends itself very, very well to a forward or extended eye relief scope mounted like this in the forward position. And I also, one of the other things I did to it was I put a rubber butt stock on it, because like most of those surplus military rifles, if you've ever shot a Mauser or Springfield, or God forbid you shoot one of these very much with a steel butt plate on it, the recoil will get your attention. I don't think it's necessarily the beastly recoil that it kind of has the reputation for, but certainly it's not a puppy. It will whack you, and especially when you have that metal butt plate that we originally came with on the back there. Yeah, that'll gouge your collarbone a little bit if you keep that up with that for, you know, a couple boxes on a nice summer afternoon when you're not wearing a coat or something, and you will definitely know you've been firing a rifle that means business after you spend an afternoon shooting a Mosin Nagant. The Mosin Nagant, like most of those rifles, battle rifles from that time, featured in where the scope is, there was actually a big, nasty rear sight, just like the Mausers, just like the Springfields. It was a graduated sight that was on a kind of a ramp, and you push some buttons and you were able to slide it out and read against a graded, system of measurement for extended range. And strangely, well, it's not strangely, it wasn't strange to the Russians, because that's how they measured things back then. They actually called it, the unit of measurements, not meters. When you see it on one of those old Russian rear sights there, you see it graduated off and marked starting, I think, at 200, 300, 400. It goes all the way up to 700, or excuse me, 2,700. It's not meters, it's not yards. It's actually called arshiny, which is a unit of measure that the Russians had at that time. It was basically amounts to around 28 inches. It was the step of a soldier, you know, in marching. And I found that kind of humorous as I was thinking about it today. If those of you like me who spent a good portion of your youth in high school or college marching band, and you can still, you know, get up in the middle of the night and close your eyes and do 8 to 5 out in the driveway, and you're still nailing it perfect. That's your step for 8 to 5 up and down a football field is 28. I think it's 28 and a half inches specifically. But I just found it humorous that, the Russian measurement for a soldier's step, and, all the marching bands from here to wherever, across the United States and other places, when you're marching up and down a football field, 8 steps to 5 yards comes out to about 28 and a half inches per step, I believe. And so I kind of was thinking about that today, kind of got a chuckle out of it. But anyway, so yeah, Mosin Nagant, I think it's a lot of fun to shoot. Let's just talk about that cartridge for a second. This is the cartridge right here. This is the Mosin Nagant. This is what it looks like. Again, it's 30 caliber, 7.62 by 54R. The 54 meaning the case is 54 millimeters long. So a minute ago I said something about, oh yeah, it's a poor man's 30-06. Well, not exactly. This is a 30-06 round here, and you can see 30-06 is quite a bit larger in terms of case than the Mosin round. But the Mosin does compare pretty favorably to 308. Now, it didn't at the time. You got to understand, the 308 came around, 50 years later, as far as being a military cartridge. Again, 30 caliber, and again, it's look at me putting it right in front of my face like an idiot. Anyway, it is 30 caliber, and as I said before, the 308, that cartridge is 51 millimeters long. A European designation of our, for NATO, they call it the 7.62 by 51. And so it's very similar in size to 308. And I think it's kind of very similar in performance, especially Nowadays, with the Mosin Nagant, you can get it, of course, loaded with modern powders and modern bullets, and it stands up very favorably ballistic wise to a 308. And we're going to stop here for a minute and listen, because that's all the 308 guys out there that do all that serious shooting with 308. That's the sound of all their heads spinning right now, because I've said that Mosin Nagant 7.62 by 54R is comparable to a 308. In modern loadings, it is. There's no doubt about it. Originally, it was a bit of a dog. It shot 210 grain bullet, I believe, and it was pretty lacking in terms of what they needed in terms of distance, especially after even in World War One, and so they set out to do some things with it to try and boost its performance. And by World War II, they kind of had it going pretty good. They had incorporated a Spitzer design bullet, which was kind of new. Thank you, Germany. And its performance nowadays is really pretty good. I don't hand load for it. I don't shoot it enough, and I hand load for enough other stuff. But I do like to take it out and shoot it. So I just buy this ammunition is manufactured in Russia, but you can buy it here online from any Midway or Shooter's Supply or whoever. You can get almost endless variety of ammunition for the Mosin Nagant. It's not that expensive, so I just buy it in bulk every once in a while, have it shipped in. And this particular one happens to use a metal case, which isn't all that unusual for Russian ammunition, some sort of a case other than brass. And but anyway, I do have a lot of fun shooting this rifle. It's just a really cool touch piece back into our history, and back into history that the United States was very closely associated with World War One and World War Two. And again, for those of you who may be millennials or otherwise disadvantaged, the Soviet Union in World War Two and the Russian Imperial Army fought as allies to us in World War One and in World War Two, respectively. They were on our side. So yeah, that's something you might want to look up if your world, United States, and World War One and World War Two history might be a little lacking. Yeah, go check that out. See whose side the various countries were on back in those days. You might find that illuminating. But anyway, I do take this rifle to the range, shoot it off the bench, shoot it off hand, bang a lot of steel targets with it out to as far as 500 yards. Again, this does have a scope. It's just a 2x7 scope, and so it's not it's nothing really fancy. But at my age, with my eyes, I'm not shooting iron sights. Again, as I said before, the iron sights on these rifles and the Mauser and the Springfield, they left a little bit to be desired. It's just simply a V-notch and a post, and on these long barrels, man, it's a little hard to deal with. But you have to remember that those rifles were being handed mostly to kids that were 18, 20 years old, and their eyes are a lot better. They can deal with those type of sights a lot better than us older guys are. And so I did modify that. So it's for me, it makes it a rifle that I can shoot. It makes it a rifle I can enjoy shooting. Actually, I have a Mauser, and I was looking to do a workup on a rifle where I could, I was interested in having a rifle, a surplus rifle to shoot. And when it came down to it, I worked up the Mauser this way, and then I did the Mosin this way, and I started shooting them both. And really, the Mosin, for all intents and purposes, it outperforms the Mauser, an 8mm Mauser, especially in the example of the Mauser that I have. The accuracy is just pretty hideous. It's nothing to you get excited about at all. So this rifle is really compared very favorably to almost anything else I have in my gun safe in terms of how it shoots. It's shooting it's a 203 grain bullet, and just to give you an example here. Here's a target. I was out the other day, out at the range here in Nebraska. It was like 7 degrees out, and there was a wind going from 5 to 15 miles an hour. And so I went to the range on purpose on that particular day with a couple of my different rifles, because you never learn anything shooting rifles when it's 70 degrees and sunshine and blue skies. That's not going to teach you anything. You got to get out there when it's crap to learn anything about shooting your rifles. So that's why I was out there on that day. And so here we have a group, 4 shots. I don't know if you can see it. Hope you can. This is my aim point. This is where 4 bullets hit that I fired at this. Again, the wind was blowing, and you can look at that, and that group, I've measured it. It measures, I think, about 3 1/4 inches is what we would call that, 3 1/4 inch group. And folks would say, well, geez, that's not much of a shooter, when you're talking a 3.5 or 3 1/4 inch group. But I will point out that this target, I was shooting at this target from 200 yards away. And 200 meters actually, so it was like 220 yards. And again, I'm shooting with just a 7-power scope, which I set to 5 power for one reason or another, which I won't go into at this point on that rifle. So a 5-power scope, shooting it off a bench at 220 some yards in a very substantial and gusting wind, plus the fact that it was like 7 degrees. At 220 yards, that 3.5 inch group, that translates to roughly an MOA, minute of angle group, about 1.5 inches. So yeah, it's not tack driver, but it certainly shoots well enough to make it fun to shoot. On that day, I was banging I think it's a 3-foot gong we have out at the range at 500 yards, and probably hitting it 3 or 4 times out of every 5 that I shot at that gong at that distance. Again, in the wind, in the cold. And, what I really find amusing about the Mosin Nagant is when you are shooting steel with it at ranges, out to about 300 or 400 yards, and you're shooting at an 8 or 10 inch steel plate, swinger of some kind, and you hit that plate with this rifle, it hits with authority. It makes a big bonk, and we sometimes sit there and just giggle. You hit it, and that gong just goes rocking, and it makes a very loud clank. Very reminiscent of perhaps even like a 30-06 or something. It definitely makes a much bigger, to me, it makes a much harder impact than a 308, and certainly a bigger impact than a 30-30, which actually mentioned 30-30. This rifle actually is the cartridge that the Mosin Nagant takes is very similar in some ways to a 30-30. So here we have our 30-30 on the left, or on your right, and the Mosin Nagant on your left. So it's a 30 caliber bullet, and one of the features that they share is that both the 30-30 and the Mosin Nagant are rimmed. Unlike, say, our 308 or 30-06, which is a rimless. I don't know if you can see that. There's a groove back there. There's no rim. There's actually a groove for the extractor on a lot of the older cartridges, like the 30-30 came out in 1894. This Mosin Nagant came out in 1891. And so a lot of those cartridges back there were rimmed. There's actually a rim that sticks off the back. There's no groove. The extractor simply picks up on that rim. And so they're similar, except that, in shape, they're similar shape, kind of tapered. They're 30 caliber, both of them. 30-30 usually loaded with a max, weight bullet about 170 grains. I think that's a 150 grain cast bullet in it right there. And so the bullet in the Mosin Nagant here in this example is quite a bit bigger, because as opposed to the 150 grain 30-30 bullet, that's a 203 grain bullet. So the bullet is a lot bigger, but the case is, it's not that much shorter, a couple millimeters, it escapes me what 30-30 is in European designation. If somebody wants to put that in a comment, that would be interesting to know. But it's not that much of a difference. It's very comparable, maybe even to the length of the 308 cartridge. So it's 50 some, this being a 54 millimeter case, this is 50 some millimeters, I'm quite sure, for the 30-30. And so, they look similar. One aspect of the Mosin cartridge that is different is that the rim, the head with that rim on it, the head of the case there, this is the head down here at the end, call that, it's actually concave, which is kind of odd when you look at it. After, when you look at the primer, the area around the primer for about a millimeter. There's a millimeter circle around that primer where it's flat, and then as it starts to get out toward the edge, it actually has a curve to it. It's concave away from the primer. It actually kind of bends all the way around, so it's kind of shaped like a, I don't know, kind of like a dinner plate maybe, as opposed to the 3030, which is flat. That rim is flat on that, or the head is flat. The back of that rim does not have any curvature to it at all, but the Mosin Nagant does. For whatever reason, it does, and so to me that kind of it does create. I don't know. I've never tried to reload for it, but that's one thing. Kind of like I don't know. I think dealing with that might be a little problematic. The shell holders got to be a little different for getting that in your die, or getting that in your press, and getting your cases run up in your die. And, maybe someday, but right now I just don't feel like it. The cool thing, one of the cool things about the Mosin Nagant, as I say, there's just gobs of them around. There are also gobs of things like slings, cleaning kits. There are gobs of bayonets. Oh my gosh, bayonets for the Mosin Nagant. The Mosin Nagant, over the years, they developed and used, both in Russia and other countries, so many different bayonets. And I mean, so, they have more bayonets than the Pope has hats. I swear to goodness. It's just a lot of different bayonets. The rifle actually was designed originally to be fired with a bayonet on it. It shoots a lot differently, different point of impact, and there's a lot of work been done on YouTube out there where guys take them to the range and with the bayonet, especially on like 9130s, it makes a big difference. The rifle actually shoots a lot better with a bayonet. I never had a bayonet for this one. I've also removed the cleaning rod. I don't have that in there. I've done some additional work on this modification where the cleaning rod is not in there, but just like the Mauser and I believe the Springfield, there's a cleaning rod that runs, it fits into the stock of the rifle, so you've always got a cleaning rod with you in the battlefield. And so I do have a cleaning rod for it. It won't fit in the rifle anymore because of the way I have made this modification. But as for the rest of it, I didn't modify anything about the bolt, the feeding system, the barrel, other than to cut the barrel off and re-crown it. I did do that because I have a Dremel tool and therefore I am a gunsmith. So I did do that work on it for reasons that I won't bore you with at the moment. But anyway, as I said before, it's a kind of a really great touch piece to go back in history. This particular rifle is strangely is a rifle that if you're any kind of a collector or somebody who is interested in military, historic military rifles, this rifle, all of the serial numbers match. Which, for those of you who don't know what that may mean, is back in those days, when they made a rifle at a factory, for wartime production or other production back in those days, they stamped a serial number on the receiver. And so this one has a serial number, the Soviet crest, and the year on it, right on the receiver, right under the scope here. And so that serial number then is also stamped on all the parts of the rifle. It's usually stamped on the stock, stamped on the butt plate, stamped on the bolt in various places, at least the last, 3 or so numbers of the serial number. And you'll find it, it'll be sometimes stamped on the, if you take the sight off, it's stamped on the underside of the sight. On that rear sight, you'll find a stamping sometimes. And so this one, it's really kind of unique because this rifle is a rifle based on some of the other things that I know about it. It had been re-arsenaled, had been, refurbished after the Second World War. And I'm not really sure why. A lot of times with those refurbs, they would bring a rifle, bring the rifles in, the rifles would be damaged, the stocks would be cracked, the bolts would be wrecked, the magazines would be, bent up or missing or whatever. And so they would just start taking the rifles apart, and they would just throw, parts that could be used went in one pile, the rest of it went in the trash. And then when they were done taking all the rifles apart, they just went back through and just picked up whatever good parts were. They picked up a stock that was okay, picked up an action in a barrel that was okay, and a butt plate that was okay, and just started putting rifles back together out of those piles of parts that were laying around. And so you frequently with a lot of historic military rifles, when you get one, the parts don't match. My Mauser is nothing matches on the Mauser that I have. The parts don't even come close to matching in terms of the serial number. And so on this one though, all the parts match, all the serial numbers match, which I think is pretty cool. So I'm either left to believe that somehow this rifle, maybe it didn't see any wartime action, which is why it made it through those years in such good shape. And but then it did go through some sort of a factory re-arsenaling. I'm fairly certain of that. Yeah, after the war, it probably just got thrown in with all the ones that had, been used in the war. And then, because it was in good shape, they didn't strip it down for some reason. They didn't take it all apart. They either just rebarreled it or restocked it or whatever, unless they left everything else together. And all the serial numbers ended up matching. Even all these years later, it was all kept together. Or the other possibility is, as these were being imported into the United States, starting back in the 90s, there may have been some unscrupulous importers that, to make these rifles more attractive to buyers, collectors, it could be what they were doing is they were looking at that serial number that is definitely stamped in the receiver, and then they were going and simply grinding and restamping all the rest of the parts with that same number. So that may be why they match. I would not be surprised to learn that's the case, quite frankly, because I hardly have ever seen a Mosin, especially a 9130, that it obviously was, World War II production type rifle, where anything matches. They're usually different. So I was just shocked when I got my hands on this one that everything matched, and that may be one explanation. Maybe they don't match. And they were just simply, it was just simply something that was done by the importer when they were brought into the States. They may have just wanted to make them all match so they were, more marketable. Could be. Who knows? So, and that's rampant with any collectible or historic weapon of any kind. With these, the desirable ones are the ones that were sniper rifles. They were used as sniper rifles by the Russians and other countries and other places, other armies. And for the Russians, what they would do when they got these out of the factory, they would just take a truckload of them, go to the range with some soldiers, load them up, and they would start shooting targets with them. And the ones that shot well, those were the ones that were designated to go back to the factory and be drilled for scope mounts and stuff to be given to, so they could put a scope on them and give them to the snipers, just like you saw in Enemy at the Gate. Those guys were using a sniper rifle that was a Mosin Nagant, but it was drilled for a little side-mounted scope mount, and there were screws that went in there to hold that mount on. But the way they marked those then on the receiver, for whatever reason, they took and they stamped a P on the receiver so that the guys, at the factory would know, okay, this one is supposed to be in the pile of rifles that needs to be made into a sniper rifle. When they found out that it could shoot and it could group well, better than, average, they would take those rifles back, they would stamp a P onto the receiver, and then they would rework it, as I say, drilling it, tapping it, whatever, for the scope mount, and so it could be issued to snipers. Well, when these were brought to the United States and gobs them, you can imagine what was happening is that people went out and got aftermarket duplications of the old scopes and the old mounts and everything, and then anybody that has a stamp set can do it. They would just go with just a run-of-the-mill Mosin, and they would stamp a P on the receiver and say, okay, well, that's stamped with a P now. That means it was a sniper rifle. Historically, we know that that's what the Russians did. They stamped them with a P. So all of a sudden in the United States, there are just gobs of sniper rifles, supposedly. They have a P stamped on them, and they have some aftermarket, scope and a scope mount on them. And it's, oh yeah, that was a sniper rifle in the Second World War. Probably not. Be very suspect if anybody ever, you go into any pawn shop or a gun shop or something like that, and they tell you they've got a Mosin Nagant. It's a sniper rifle. Take that with a grain of salt, because there's a good chance it is not. It's a fake. It's not fake. It's still a Mosin Nagant, but it wasn't one of the ones that was made into a sniper rifle originally in Russia or someplace else. So anyway, as I say, I do love this rifle. I shoot it quite a bit. It's just kind of, as I said, it's kind of if you like American history at all, It's funny that I would glom onto a Russian rifle, but I think Russia and the Soviet Union, especially for somebody like me who served in the military during the Cold War, I can't say that I have a warm spot in my heart for the Soviet Union. For the most part, they can go jump in a lake as far as I'm concerned. But when it comes to the Russian people, perhaps that's a different thing. And the Russian people, I think, are largely driven by circumstances that are outside of their control. Just another quick little tidbit of history for those of you who may not know. Do you have any idea what the number of casualties were on the American side? And again, those would be largely, with the exception of like Pearl Harbor and a couple other places, those are pretty much 100% military casualties. And so the number of military casualties, or casualties, I guess they're lumping everything together. Anyway, it's roughly, I always hear the number, it's roughly somewhere around 600,000. 600,000 people were killed in the Second World War serving with the United States military. For the Russians, on the other hand, who were invaded and then had to drive the Germans out of their country again, having just had done it in the First World War, the statistic on that is something ridiculous. Like it was like somewhere, the figure that's always thrown out there is 20 million casualties between Russian, it'd be Soviet, I guess, the Soviet army and the Russian civilian population also was, involved heavily in that war, because the Germans were tromping right through their homeland, and then they tromped right back out of it. So, there was quite a few civilian casualties, for one reason or another, either battle casualties or starvation or disease, or having been captured and made into a slave and shipped off somewhere. So when you think about the Russian people, and the way their government sometimes acts, throughout history, especially coming down through the Cold War and even to modern day, they probably have a little different worldview. I've heard it's an interesting fact or it was trotted out as a fact anyway, that if you go back to like 1925 or something like that, it's the guys who would have been like 18 to 20 years old during World War II. So I think they've done a study on, I think the year was 1925. I could be wrong about that. But in Russia, if you were a male born in let's say 1925, it's one of those years right in there. They would have been around 20 years old at the time of the Second World War, or just a little bit younger than that when they were taken in, age 17 or 18. So anyway, whatever year they picked out and did a study on, if you were a male and you were born, and you were like, born in Russia, went into the military when you're like 18 or 20 years old, the chances of you being alive at the end of World War II was like 2%. So in other words, for those years, in the 20s, that produced the males that served in the Russian army during the Second World War, 98% of those men were dead by 1945. So just think about that. Think about that, having a whole year's worth, and that's just 1 year. It was the other years in there, whatever years you want to pick in the 20s, those birth groups for those males that served in the Soviet army, extensive casualty rate by 1945. There's almost no men left of that age group, that were born in the 20s. By the time the end of the war happens in 1945, certainly, half, 3/4 at least of those guys are dead and gone, and probably a lot more than that. I forget what year. I wish I could remember. I forget what year they actually did the study on. But I think it was sometime in the 20s, maybe. But anyway, it was, they said, okay, if you were born in that year and you were a Russian male, the chances of you being alive after 1945 was like 2%. So that may be why sometimes the Russians look at things a little differently and act a little, what seems to be contrary to the way we want them to act. But again, as I said, I have no great love for the Soviets. But when it comes to the Russian people, that's who this rifle was made for. Is really, it was made with them in mind, because anytime they got into a war over in Russia, no matter how large and how good their army was, it always seemed to ended up in a situation where at the end they were in desperate straits, trying to drive an enemy out. Their people were starving, their armies were starving. They had those horrible winters in Russia. Their people were being rounded up and taken away as slaves and prisoners, and they were literally fighting for not just existence of their country, but for their very existence. And that's who this rifle was made for. That's why they took them every time a war was over, and refurbed them and then packed them away in a warehouse for next time, because they knew, the Russians know, next time is coming. And I think that's what drives a lot of their thinking. Even today, they are very much aware that next time is coming. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we don't really have any concept of that. Even the current generations, even though we've been at war, supposedly at war in Afghanistan for 20 years, American people that has not impacted American lives, day-to-day lives, the way even day-to-day lives were effective in World War II here in America, with all the rationing and the sacrifices and everything that the civilian population was forced to do. Nothing like that has happened for a long time here in America. Now that said, that is not reflective of my feelings at all, in terms of the military men and women and their families that have been serving over there in the Mideast and those other god-awful places we've been in the last 20, 30 years. That's a whole different ball of wax. The sacrifices made by those individuals, those servicemen and women and their families, is certainly something to be honored and treasured, and certainly not overlooked at all. And I'm sure we all have people in our circle of family or friends that that have made those sacrifices. So I'm not belittling those wars that we're involved with. I'm just simply saying the Russian people, when they get into a war, it's a little bit different than the experiences of most other countries, and especially here in America. It's so you got to kind of take that into consideration. So that it was along those lines that when I was looking for a name for the channel, I was like, well, it's great. There's all these different firearms manufacturing going on, pretty great right now. There's just no limit to the companies that are making AR-15 and other black rifles and all the stuff that goes with them. It's great. It's fantastic. I love those rifles. I have them. I build them. I shoot them. They're really great. But those rifles have very adequate representation if you get out on YouTube or Facebook or wherever. There's quite a bit of reputation and exposure for those companies and for those examples of those rifles. There's no end of different kinds of competitions and whatnot, with guys running around out there that are celebrities, basically rock stars, with their company names all over their shirts and their hats, and they're making a living promoting the firearms and of a given company, through competition or whatever. And, so those companies, be it Glock or be it, Daniel Defense, or, and I'm aging myself there. Daniel Defense is like, they're a great company, but they're really kind of a company that's been around for a long time. There are many, many more doing the same thing that are, a lot newer, which is great. It's a great testimony to the American economy and the American people, that one of the largest segments of growth in our economy over the last 20 years or longer has actually been the firearms industry. Nobody will tell you that, but that is something that has really been driving hard, the last 20 years, especially the last 15 years, 10 years. It's been a very growing and successful part of the American economy. But those people have their voice, and it's great. They have their voice, and so when I was looking for an identity for my channel, I said, I'm more old school. I'm more, maybe old world, and so we'll be Team Mosin. We'll take up the mantle for the ideas and the inspiration for the Mosin Nagant rifle, which in a lot of ways still holds true today. You know, and so I just kind of why I chose it. You know, the M1 Garands and the M14s. You know, historically the Mausers, and you know the Springfield 30-06 rifle. You know, 1911s, any of those historic weapons, M1 carbines, which I have one. You know, they all have their websites and their chat rooms and their Facebook pages and their forums. And I know they're out there for the Mosins too. But the Mosins it's kind of more of an underground thing. I was going to say it's more of a religion, but actually it's more of a cult when you run into a group of Mosin aficionados and enthusiasts. You know, they're just, you know, it's very cult-like and very enthusiastic, but it's, you know, they live, breathe, and die, these Mosin rifles, and for good reason. I mean, I think they're a lot of fun, and I think they're very worthy of being in your collection. Many of you guys probably have these. If you haven't gotten it out and shot it for a while, man, you know, get it out, take it out. They're a blast. I mean, you know, they're a really fun rifle to deal with, and I would encourage you to, you know, take all your rifles out. Good heavens, you know, get them all out and shoot them, and you know, have some fun. But when I grab onto a Mosin or a Mauser or, you know, anything from the World War I, World War II era, it just gets me thinking about, you know, the history of the countries and the men and women that fought and struggled for the things that you know, that we enjoy here today in America, and the things that Americans have enabled those things to be enjoyed in other parts of the world. It's really remarkable, and it's really worth taking note of and appreciating. So that's kind of what, you know, I'm not choosing the Mosin over some American icon, you know, from that era. I'm choosing to include the Mosin for those aspects of it that do to appeal to those reasons that it was developed and it was so widely used and popular and effective. You know, the Russians used it basically. World War I and World War II drove the enemy out twice. I mean, you know, when I say the Russians, I mean the Russian people. I mean, the army, of course, was heavily involved, but the Russian people were down in the dirt, down in the trenches, and most of them were carrying a rifle like this or something very similar. You know, it's remarkable to think that this rifle was being still used and issued as a frontline battle rifle, even, you know, almost 20 years after the AK-47 was developed by the Russians. This rifle never went away, and it still hasn't gone away in that the cartridge itself, the again 7.62 by 54R, is still being fielded in modern armies, in modern production weapons. It's used in, there's machine guns that take this weapon, or excuse me, take this cartridge. And there are a number of sniper rifles. The one that you may be most familiar with is the Dragunov, which I believe is a rifle of Russian origin, and probably other places where it's been developed and produced and deployed. But it takes this same cartridge. So you have a cartridge that was first trotted out in 1891, and here we are, you know, ready to begin the third decade of the you know, of the 21st century. And this cartridge is still out there as something that is a viable and very effective battle implement. It's just remarkable. And so, taking that all into consideration, that's how I just decided, yeah, we'll go with Team Mosin. We'll take up that mantle, along with, you know, anything else that we want to talk about. But I kind of wanted to get that out there. If you're interested, let me know. You know, hit the Facebook page. Again, like and share and subscribe to this video. And then let me know if you're interested in hearing me talk about the mods that I did to this rifle. You know, I know that if you're a real one of those cult members for the Mosin Nagant world, you probably just want to have me hung up and you know, and strung out for doing this to a Mosin Nagant. But again, this is one. There's nothing special about this rifle. There's no collector's value. These 9130s with the round receiver like this, you know, they're a dime a dozen. There's a Cabela's about a mile from my house. I think they had 20 of them on the shelf the last time I was in there. And so, you know, that's that's, that's the deal. It's just a great rifle, and that's why I did modify it, because I wanted to shoot it. I wanted the chance to take it out and appreciate it, along with all my other rifles and pistols and shotguns that I take out. I felt this rifle, with its history in development, and all the contributions it has made, it deserved to be included. And so that's why I am enthusiastic about it. That's why I do, and have such a respect for it, along with many other weapons that are iconic for their own reasons. This one kind of deserves to be, up to a certain point, looked at in that same light. And so that's what's in the name. But that's kind of why we went with Teammosin, because I kind of felt, well, maybe that was a niche that kind of needed to be filled. Some of those things need to be talked about and thought of and presented, and so that's kind of where the angle we're coming from. So again, if you're interested in the mods that I've done, how I did them, where I got the ideas from them, none of this was my original thought, obviously. Drop me a note, hit me up on Facebook, and just say, hey, you'd like to see a video where I talked about, maybe a little more in depth about where I came up with these ideas for this, and and what I did, and how it's working out. And anyway, thank you again. If this is your first time joining us, I think it's still early enough in the year. I'll tell you, I wish you a happy 2019. Again, please like and share and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you very much.